Hello and welcome to Spirituality in Times of Crisis, brought to you by Northern Westchester Hospital. My name is the Reverend Angela Maddalone, and I'm the Director of Spiritual Services at Northern Westchester Hospital, and I will be your moderator this evening. I'd like to introduce to you all the panelists for the evening. Rabbi Aaron Brusso, Senior Rabbi at Temple Beth Torah in Mount Kisco. Reverend Dr. Michael Tino, Minister of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Northern Westchester in Mount Kisco. Reverend Tenku Ruff, the Soto Zen Buddhist priest, and who is also the Director of Spiritual Services at Phelps Hospital. And the Reverend Merle Mc Junkin, pastor of Antioch Baptist Church in Bedford Hills, New York, and Imam Mohammed Shafiq Chase from the Islamic Center of New Rochelle. Welcome to all of our panelists. Tonight we'll have an interfaith conversation about the role of our spiritual lives during times of crisis, such as our current pandemic or chronic illness or the death of a loved one. We will explore how our spiritual lives help us cope and create meaning in times of crisis. I will be asking each of the panelists the following questions and ask them to answer based on their faith's perspective. What does your faith tradition say about suffering? How has the present pandemic or other experiences of suffering altered your beliefs about suffering? And what is the hope you can offer in times of crisis? Now, before we get started, please know that if you have questions during the presentation, put them in the question and answer or chat function, and we will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. So let's get started. I'm going to be starting with you, Rabbi Brusso. I hear so often in my work at the hospital from patients or from families saying some version of, he or she is such a good person. You know, why is this happening to him or her? So I was wondering what your tradition has to say about suffering, especially innocent suffering.
Right. Angela, thanks so much. And thanks for putting together this amazing group of people. I have such high respect for each one of them. It's an honor just to be in their presence. So you ask a pretty big question. There's many ways to answer it, but I'll provide the following, which is a text from the Talmud. So in the Talmud, it says that there's two stones in Jerusalem. There's the Even Hashtiyah, which is the foundation stone upon which the world was created, where the temple stood, and where Muhammad ascended to his night journey. And then there's another stone called the Even HaTohen, which is the stone of claiming. And at that stone, anybody who lost anything would stand and declare and describe their loss, and people would listen to their losses. It was a place that people could go to hear about people's losses. And I mean, I just imagine that was a very powerful place. So there's a story about Choni HaMa'agel, who was a particular guy who would pray for rain and rain would come. And the inhabitants of Jerusalem said, it's dry, we need rain. Choni, please pray. Choni prayed, it rained, and the whole city flooded. It flooded so much that the people had to seek refuge on the Even Hashtiyah, the foundation stone, where the temple was. And they said to Choni, please stop the rain. There's too much rain now. And he said, go and see if the stone of claiming is submerged. And if it is, then I will pray for the rain to stop. So I think the Talmud is saying something interesting about where the Holy of Holies really is, that it's not in the place necessarily where we establish our master narratives, but where we announce the things we've lost. where we
Mm,
announce our losses and we expose our vulnerabilities,
mhm.
and where vulnerability can meet help and love.
Yeah.
And the place doesn't tell us what we need to do so that we don't lose things, but what our obligations are in the face of loss, what we need to do for other people.
Yeah. Wow, that is really interesting. Thank you so much from that perspective. Um, Reverend Majunkin, central to Christianity, as we know, is the idea of redemptive suffering. Take up your cross and suffer in silence, I hear people often say to me. Yet so many Christians have asked me in my work, is God punishing me? Or why is this happening to me? What would you say about suffering then from a Christian perspective? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. I was going to say, well, it's so varied. There's so many different perspectives. Um, and so I even within the Baptist tradition, the last research I did was there are over 100 different Baptist groupings within the United States, and each can have different practices and perhaps different beliefs. And then I have to add on the layer of the African American experience as well. So I come from a conglomeration of faith traditions, even though I'm Baptist.
Mhm.
So I came up with 9 quick things, and I'm going to do them very quickly. So when we start thinking about suffering, sometimes we say, what do we say? We say, take the long view, that ultimately God's people will triumph. And sometimes evil now turns into a better or best situation later on. And so we think about Joseph in Genesis 45, where Joseph has been sold into slavery by his brothers and has gone through all these horrible things in Egypt, but rises to a position that by Genesis 45, he's able to save his family. We would say there's reason and rationale for the suffering, but it may be beyond our understanding. So God's ways are above our ways. God is good, but God is also mysterious to us. It's a little bit above our pay grade to be able to say why we suffer, when we suffer, even though it may be innocent suffering. But we say that God is the source of strength in time of trouble. So trouble is all around. You can almost feel this from the African American tradition. Trouble is all around, but God is near to provide comfort and deliverance. And there's purpose in what happens. And so from Romans chapter 8, verse 28, in all things, God is going to work for the good. Not everything is going to be good, but it will work for the good. And that's a whole lot of faith and hope right there. In the midst of suffering, we're still secure, because in that same Romans chapter 8, it says that nothing can separate us from the love of God. And so even as we're going through, we're being held close to God's own very heart, and God goes with us and God goes before us. Ultimately, we get the Job kind of issue there. Ultimately, who are we to question what God is doing or God allows? God is the potter, we are the clay. The Job question, Job, where were you? You're bringing me all of these questions, but where were you when I was forming and creating? So there's that one. I'm going to finish up the last 3 really quickly. There's also the sense of that demonic powers wreak havoc in the world or with the world right now. And so there are satanic forces or satanic beings that are the source of much evil and suffering and spiritual bondage right now. So Ephesians chapter 6, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. So it's a little deeper than just what the eye can see before us. But God will intervene very soon. As Dr. King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Or God will vindicate the righteous. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. I will avenge. I think that's Romans 12. Correct me where I go wrong. And then there's the idea of suffering may help to discipline us or test us. It may help us to develop our faith, that we can be strengthened or refined or perfected. Not ultimately perfected, but become more perfect, made more perfect, even through the challenging and rough places in life. So those are 9 quick things that I think the tradition offers. There's some others, of course, but I wanted to offer from the Baptist and African American tradition. And so this suffering being redemptive, some of that doesn't wash quite so well when you think about American chattel slavery.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so you won't hear quite so much that preached from too many African American and Baptist pulpits.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your comments. Reverend Tenku. So many years ago.
You've got mail.
Many years ago, sorry about that, the pop psychologist M. Scott Peck, in his book, The Road Less Traveled, in his opening chapter said, life is difficult. I'm paraphrasing here, when he went on to say that once we accept this, life is no longer difficult. So this reminded me of many Buddhist teachings. And so I was wondering what you could offer from your tradition about suffering.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. That is it. That's the core. And that's the central teaching of all different Buddhist traditions, what we call the Four Noble Truths. And the first one is suffering is. Just like that. We're human, we suffer. And once we get over our very strong desire to bypass or to get around suffering, once we accept that as part of our human conditions, and we can work with it. And the rest of the path lays out how to do that. Suffering is. So why do we suffer? We suffer because we try to hold on to things. As we all know, change is constant. Even 5 minutes ago is so different from now. So in the midst of this constant change, when we try to hold on to things, then we suffer. This is the cause of suffering. But, the thing is, the cessation of suffering is possible. It lies in, letting go of that strong holding on and following the spiritual path. That's it. So the fourth noble truth is following the path, how we live our life, how we are in the world, how we treat others, how we speak, what kind of job we have, and how we keep our mind. So it's actually very deceptively simple. Suffering is. We suffer because we hold on. The cessation of suffering is possible by following the spiritual path. That's it. So when we think about losing our pen, maybe not such a big deal. I am attached to my pen. I love this pen. I'm going to hold on to it forever. And if we lose it, then we suffer. Pen's not so hard to let go of. But when we think about a parent, that's a really different thing. Fortunately, the path is right here for us, whatever our spiritual path is. And this is the way that we work with suffering. So thank you for asking.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your response. Wow, everyone is so amazing here tonight. Imam Chase, sometimes in my work, I've heard people wonder, am I being tested? It made me think of another phrase often spoken by families or patients or those in the midst of suffering, God never gives me or gives us more than we can handle. And I always wonder about that. And I was just wondering if from your tradition's understanding of suffering, what you might say.
Thanks, Reverend, for that question. And I want to thank Rabbi Aaron for sharing those profound words. And more of those 9, I think you could have gone on much more. And Reverend Tenku, what a solace to bring you into that state of tranquility, that what you just said. In the Quran, the 2nd chapter, which is the chapter named Baqarah, in the 155 verse, it says that وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ, that certainly we will test you with a bit of fear, not fear itself, but just, he puts a disclaimer in the verse saying that we will test you with something of fear. Because imagine if we're in a state of fear like we are now, constantly, what the war would be. So we're in a state of fear, but just a little bit. And he will test you with hunger. And he'll test you with a loss of wealth. And he will test you with the loss of lives. And he will test you with loss of fruits. And the best among you in this time of tests and trials is the perseverer with patience. And if you look at the pandemic, the time that we're living in, the first thing that came to us and still exists is fear. We're in that state of fear. And when you're in this state of fear, it drives you to do things like we see across the country. When we, in this state of fear, we go into the supermarket and it becomes me, me, me. And we do things that are very irrational, and it drives us to that state of hunger. And when you're in that state of hunger, you expend all your wealth, you lose all your wealth, and you see this is a problem across the country, across the globe, that we are talking about a next stimulus package to help the poor and the needy, people who lost their jobs. And then he says, you will see a loss of lives. And look at the reality. I just, there was a beautiful article in the Guardian News about 7 RN from different hospitals across the nation. One of them said that, it's interesting that we're treating husband and wives together. I was on the first floor treating a wife, and she's concerned, how is my husband on the floor below? And after she finished treating the wife, she went to the floor below, and the husband says, I heard my wife is upstairs and she's not doing that well. But it's so nice to talk to you because you just talked to my wife, and I don't know if I will be able to talk to her again. And by the time she get to the first floor, the wife had passed. The husband, he recovered and he went home. So actually he never get to say anything to his wife. And we're just yearning for this. And the verse is saying that we will see a loss of lives and a loss of fruits. We will see our future dwindling in front of us. But the thing that we should pray for today is patience. Patience for a vaccine. Patient to wait to hug your loved ones. This patience is something that is imperative in this time of need. I would like just to talk about what our Rabbi says so beautifully about praying for the flood. It reminds me of a time of the Bani Israel, the people of the book, that there was a famine in Egypt, and they asked Moses to pray for rain. And he went into the open field with all the Bani Israel, the people, and they bring their cattle and everything, and you can see the famine, the suffrage that they all are going through. We're all in this together. And he lifts his hands to God and he's praying and no rain is coming. And he asks God, why is there no rain? God says, there a man among you have been sinning for 40 years. He's been trying me. And as long as he's among you, I will not send rain. Moses addressed the nation and says, who among you have been sinning? Now this man finds himself in a predicament. Do I walk and everyone will see the sinner? Or do I stay here and repent? And rain started to come and nobody left. So Moses turned to God and says, why did you send rain? No one left. God says, it's because of that sinner I sent rain. And if he had asked me for anything, I would have given to him, because he turned in this state of repentance, with its sincere repentance to God, that it was accepted right there, and rain came because of that forgiveness. Mm-hmm. So we're all in this together. Whatever you do will affect me, and whatever I'll do will affect you. Mm-hmm. We're all in this together, and we all will come out of this with the mercy of God, like Reverend Merle said so beautifully in one of his 9, these are trials and tribulations that Yusuf, Jacob, if you want to look at the suffrage, you look at the eponymous chapter of Yusuf, where he suffered, where his father Jacob suffered. you know, everyone in that, and he come out with no vengeance to his brother. He says, come and I will give you the provision of the land, you know. So we're all in this together, and by the mercy of God, we will come out of it together.
Thank you so much for those inspiring words. Thank you. Last but not least, Reverend Tino. I read on a from one of the Universalist churches, a beautiful essay about leaning into the mystery, right? And it made me think of this post that the writer Elizabeth Gilbert had put on her Facebook page, and she said, "Life is a mystery," and there's a period at the end of that sentence. And it made me think of that article I read from the Universalist Church. And I know that your tradition draws on many sources for wisdom. So I was wondering what's your perspective about suffering?
Thank you for asking. So it's important to start with the fact that Unitarian Universalism is a non-creedal faith. So we require our people to make their own meaning and articulate their own theologies, which makes it difficult to come up with one answer to your question. But I think if I want to look at that through the lens of my own theology, I think I would start with that place that suffering is part of the human condition. But the next place that I go is that not all suffering is created equal. And that some suffering happens because of love and loss. The suffering of grief happens because we have made ourselves vulnerable enough to love someone and be attached to them, so that when we lose them, it is hard to say goodbye. It is hard to detach. It is hard to accept that loss. But some suffering comes because of broken relationships. And Pastor Mc Junkin alluded to some of that some suffering comes because people are dehumanized and devalued at the hands of others. And that kind of suffering is not equally distributed in our population. Those of us who are living through this pandemic and paying attention know that the suffering of this pandemic is not equally distributed in our population, that especially people of color in our communities are dying at a disproportionate rate. The process theologian in me says that God, that which is the ultimate love in the universe, that which is the most holy in the universe, suffers along with those of us who suffer, and doesn't cause it, but our suffering is God's suffering too. And I don't know if that's comfort to anyone, but it is what I believe about it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. I'm in the looking at the time, and we want to leave some time for questions. I was wondering if you would just each of you quickly talk about, if any of your own personal theology has changed in light of this pandemic, and what is the hope you can offer people in this time of crisis? Just if you can, answer both or just one of those, but what is the hope that especially that we can offer people? Reverend Brusso, would you like to start?
Yeah, so in terms of my beliefs, I just want to share that Tenku actually taught me something once that really has resonated during this pandemic. She said that one of the problems that we have is that when we are sad or disappointed or down, we further immiserate ourselves by telling ourselves we shouldn't be feeling those things. And that culturally in America, we're not supposed to be sad, we're supposed to be happy. And what that ends up doing is we doubly punish ourselves. And so I have really seen that play out during this pandemic. There's been pervasive disappointment and suffering and sadness. And I appreciate what Reverend Tino talked about in terms of, you know, different kinds of suffering. But in a lot of cases, I've been counseling people to say what you're feeling now is okay, and that's where you're at. And just being where you're at right now with that feeling is giving yourself permission to feel it and not feel like you have to be somewhere else. Be kind to yourself. And so I want to thank Reverend Tenku for teaching me that. In terms of hope, you know, this has been just a crazy time. And there are two people in my community who were least likely to inspire me and give me hope, simply because I would usually put them in the category of most vulnerable. One is a 4-year-old, and one is a 90-something widow. So one day in April, in the middle of crazy calls and Zooms, I got a letter in the mail with children's handwriting on it, my name. And I opened it up, and there was this bracelet inside. And a 4-year-old was making bracelets and had thought of me and wanted me to have it. And it just made my day. And the second thing is that just before Thanksgiving, this widow in her 90s called, and I assumed I was going to be counseling her for her sense of isolation and sadness and so forth. And so she said, "How are you? How's your family?" I said, "How are you?" She said, "Oh, you know, things are difficult, but I just want to know. I every year my husband and I would donate a turkey. Where's the best place that I could donate a turkey this year?" And it was just amazing to me that at a time when we're feeling so powerless, that a 4-year-old reminded me how much power we have to make a difference in someone's day by making them feel thought of. And a 90-something-year-old widow reminded me we're not just an accumulation of our needs, but we're at any given moment empowered to give to other people. So those two gave me tremendous hope.
Reverend, you need to unmute your.
Yeah, Angela's muted.
Oh, no. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. Simple acts of kindness. So thanks. How about you, Reverend Tino?
So I think I'm going to skip to the hope part because I don't know that I've learned anything other than maybe just how resilient people can be in the face of suffering. Though I had an idea about that before, so it's not like some great new epiphany. I think I find hope in the love that gets shown in community. I love those two examples that Rabbi Brusso brought up. But you know, when I had to tell my congregation in March that we were not going to be meeting together for the foreseeable future, what I said to them at that point was, this is an act of love for each other and for our community, that we are choosing a path that is hard for our hearts, but what we need to keep each other safe and what we need to keep our community safe. We are, every time we gather on Zoom for worship, showing love to each other and to our community. And that love connects us and that love sustains us. And we're still a community and we're still connected and we're still doing for one another. We are still feeding the people at the Interfaith Food Pantry in Mount Kisco. We are still housing those experiencing homelessness in our county in the emergency shelter. We are still paying attention to the injustices happening in our world. We are still connected to one another through love. And that's what's going to get us through. And so that's where the hope for me comes, is that those connections have not been broken by this pandemic, by the evil in our world. Those connections have not been broken, and they will survive with us. And so that's where I am. We don't know how long this is going to last, but we know that love is eternal,
Mm,
and that's the hope I have.
thank you so much. Thank you so much. How about you, Tenku?
Yeah, for me, my learning has been very strong during this pandemic. And what I really learned myself is, as spiritual leaders, we have to be available for everyone. And, I know from Buddhist teachings that we are not separate, that we are all here. But there was a tiny part of me that still felt like I was going to help those people. And what's come home for me over and over and over is I am those people. Even as I became sick in my own body. So I am one of the people, and my own parent becoming sick. I am somebody who's facing the loss of a parent. I am that person who's afraid or angry or sad or just tired. And this has been so sharp for me over and over and over and over. And this very strong understanding of my connection with every single person in the universe is what gives me hope. And it comes in every single day in the tiniest little sparks. I once, heard a pastor from Detroit speaking on hope as not a way out, but a way through. Quoting Robert Frost, hope is not a way out, it's a way through. So a lot of us we're in this place where, like, when this pandemic is over, or if we can just get past this, or, when systemic racism is over, then that one day when we get to the end of all of this, then we'll be happy. But our happiness is right now and how we are connecting with each other. So we're learning and growing, with our hearts really broken open. Hearts broken open allows us to genuinely connect. And this is so beautiful. What it means is that what we do matters. Every single thing we do matters, and we can make a difference. Everything that we do has an effect. And this gives me so much hope. So it gets me out of looking for an outcome and more filled with this luminous possibility, luminous, endless possibility that we can be what we want this world to be. And it feels so sharp for me right now. So that's where I am in this.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. How about you, Mom? Where is the hope for you?
Again, out of over 6,000 verses of the Quran, this always gets me. There's over 6,000 verses, and according to the consensus of the scholar, the most beloved verse out of these 6,000 is not to be hopeless, is to not be in the state of despair. And it says beautifully, the way God says it, it says, قُلْ يَا عِبَادِيَ الَّذِينَ أَسْرَفُوا عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ. La is a negation. He says, oh my servant, oh my beloved servant, do not go into this state of despair. It is the worst state to be in. It leads to so many dark places. So I think it's not to go into this state of hopelessness. And, many of you probably read this bestseller. It's called The Rabbit Effect, wrote by a Columbia professor, Kelly Harding. She came home while she was doing her residency. She got a text from her mom, and the text was not very coherent in terms of its grammar. And her mom, being a school teacher, she was surprised at this text. Being a doctor, she says, perhaps my mom is having a stroke. So she went over to her mom's house, took her to the hospital. She got a stroke. She put everything on hold and stood by her mom's bed until in a couple of days, her mom passed away. And hope can come from, comfort can come from places that we least expected. And she's with her mom and she would squeeze, and they developed this communication that her mom would squeeze 3 times, I love you. And she would squeeze 3. That's the only function her mom had for days. Mm-hmm. Until that day when the squeeze did not return. Mm. So she came home. She had 3 little boys, like our Rabbi just shared with us, that 4-year-old. She had a 3-year-old son that she did not share this communication, this relationship with her mom and squeeze. The mom used to be the babysitter of her 3-year-old son. The son came at night to hug the mom, his mom, and says to her, Mommy, do we have grandma anymore with us? She says, no, grandma is in a better place. She's in heaven. And he lay in her chest and he squeezed her hand 3 times before he fell asleep. She did not share this with no one else, but that's how we are connected. Mm. We're so interconnected that we see that what's happening in the home with the stress of the adults, it's affecting the children without we knowing it. Yeah. Like this famous doctor who's a world-renowned doctor in addiction, Gabo Mate. When he was a 2-month-old baby, he shared a story in Budapest during World War II, when this heinous crime was being committed. His mom called the pediatrician and says, come to see my son, he's crying. The pediatrician says, yes, I will come to see him, but let me tell you, all the babies are crying. Mm. He grew up to be a scientist and he wanted to know what happened then. He found out that he was crying because he was feeling the pain of his mother, the insecurity of his mother. So we're all in this together, and comfort, we will see comfort coming from places that is least expected. And we pray for comfort for everyone, especially those who lost their loved ones.
That is certainly a place of hope. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Reverend Mc Junkin, hope for you. Where do you see hope?
Well, let me put those 2 questions together really quickly. And so in the tradition, in my faith tradition, God of the people, yes, but a personal relationship with God, God who is with you. So in my experience, 1974, I was 5 years old, accident playing with a friend, or my brother actually, resulted in my broken right thigh. My femur was broken mid-shaft. 74, so there's no rods. It took 3 months before I was able, from the accident to when I was able to try to stand again. The first 32 days I was in traction on my back in the hospital with my leg in traction, and a lot of pain for most of those days. After that, they put a lower body cast on me from the hips all the way down to the ankle on one side, from the hips all the way down to the knee on the other side, and solid in the middle with holes for necessary purposes. That was 6 weeks. And then after they cut me out of the cast after 6 weeks, then I was not allowed to try to walk again for another 2 weeks. My hospital roommates would come and go, but I stayed. And then my kidneys went out, began going out. I was down to 50% kidney functioning in 2004. By 2008, I was on dialysis. The best solution for me to continue to pastor was for me to do my hemodialysis at home. And so my 6 or 7 days a week, I was on for a 5-hour session each evening. I would put my needles in my arm myself, and I was trained to operate my own machine and to take care of things in case of challenge or problem. And I did that for years until I was blessed to receive a kidney transplant from someone that I did not expect it from. It was not a cadaver kidney, it was a live donation. So, if we think family systems theory, back when in my really formative years was this traumatic experience. And so what did I learn and what would I share? Hang on, appreciate moments of light and levity in the midst of times of suffering. If you can't find joy, create joy for oneself in the midst of it all. And know that, weeping is going to happen, but hope for and pray for and wait for the change that will come. In the midst, my experience was, Merle, you're not alone. God's love is manifest all around you. And some of the most, just looking around creation, seeing the beauty and reminding myself of the presence of God. That God keeps God's promises to us to never leave us nor forsake us. And finally, we're in the season right now of Advent. And in Advent, not only is it a time of waiting for what is to come, the Lord is coming, but it's also a time that at the end of that, we get Emmanuel, God with us. And so living in the presence with God with us. Finally, I would say that help, from my experience in life, help in recovery come in unexpected times and in unexpected ways. And so we don't know when and we don't know how. I did not know Michael Samuels was not a great friend of mine, and yet he came and said, this is what I'm called and led to do. I've got 2 kidneys and one of them is yours.
Wow. Wow. Well, thank you, everyone, for your thought-provoking and hopeful messages. I've certainly been enriched by everything that you have said here today. So thank you. And I look forward to carrying on these conversations in more depth. We do have a few questions that have been coming up from the chats. And I think we touched on a little bit of this first question. I'm not going to pose it to any particular person. If you feel that you have an answer or would like to respond, then I just feel free to do that. The first one is, why do so many people suffer when so many bad people don't? I think in all of our traditions, we wrestle with that question, right? Anyone want to take that one? Go for it.
It looks like I'm the only one that's not muted. It's the old problem of theodicy, evil exists. And we can frame out the argument that is just age old. It's ancient. It's an ancient argument that ultimately we cannot solve. There, for our minds and our concepts and our desire for fairness, there's no equation that satisfies those questions. And so what a blessing for me that Reverend Tenku reminded us suffering is. Yeah. Or Angela, Reverend Angela, as you have shared, you put mysterious and put the period.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Nope. Anybody else want to have a reflection about that? Well, another, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I would just say that, the formulation does kind of presume that suffering is a punishment. And I think that, we just have to acknowledge that, that's one way of framing good things and suffering in life, but not necessarily the only way of framing it. I think, as we've heard from all of us, there's many different ways to think about it. And I personally don't believe that God uses suffering as a way to send messages to people. And so when good people are suffering, or people who are morally questionable in certain ways, I don't think that's to be read as God handing down some form of judgment. And I think if we can set that frame aside, maybe we might be able to approach the question differently.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I was reminded when you said that Elaine Pagels, the writer, in her recent memoir, was talking about how she got through two very difficult losses in her life, and that the losses, she said, weren't there to, teach me anything necessarily, but from those experiences, we have an opportunity to create meaning. And that's where she found hope, not in any questioning the why does this happen, but moving in another place eventually through her grief process of, is there a way to create meaning? And not everything is, we can do that in every situation, but it moves away from, I think, trying to answer the why questions. Another question we have is, are there any spiritual practices from your traditions that we can offer to people who are going through difficult times? Anyone has anything they'd like to share with some of the participants?
I'll speak. The one that I keep coming back to over and over during this pandemic is loving kindness practice. It's a knowledge that I'm suffering, and then we create the wish, may I be free from suffering. May I be at ease. May I be happy. So it comes from the understanding that just like me, all beings don't want to suffer, and all beings want to be happy. So when we do this practice, we do it for others as well. Or just like me, may you be free from suffering, and may you be happy. And we can offer it to anyone. We can do it very intentionally. And it really helps us to connect. So where we are right now, we have such a state of crisis in the world that we really need to come back to that very basic heart connection. And, for us, that's loving kindness practice. We don't need anything fancy. We don't need anything extra. Just very simply, just like me, all beings want to be happy and don't want to suffer.
Thank you, Tenku. Reverend Tino?
So there are many different spiritual practices that Unitarian Universalists might engage in. I want to introduce you to one of mine because you can see it in the frame behind me. The pictures on the bookcase behind me are the ancestors that I carry with me, three of whom entered the ancestors died this year, since the beginning of the pandemic. And they bless my presence every time I sit here to do work. They bless my presence when I sit to write a sermon or connect with people through Zoom. And so it is my spiritual practice to honor their memory, that it might bless me and propel me forward and instruct me how to live, because I loved these folks who are behind me.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, Reverend Mc Junkin?
I'm just really just appreciating, actually the word I want to use is loving, the responses and the sense of that we keep saying, coming back to connectedness. And that anything that would cause us to kind of move away from and isolate is perhaps moving us away from the healing that we desire. Perhaps, long-term kind of isolation, but instead the connecting. And so different practices, but for the quick one for me, the first thing that came to mind was prayer. Prayers, some folks think of prayers as foxhole faith, kind of to pray to get God to do something on my behalf. But prayer simply is connection. And just talking and getting it out and feeling like I'm not alone. There is a presence, and let me speak my hope, my wishes, my desires, but let me be connected. So I'll stop there, but yeah. Prayer works.
I know we're running out of time, but just quickly, 1 second on suffrage. If we look at the story of Joseph, the best thing probably what happened to him is that his brothers threw him in that well. Because if they hadn't thrown him in that well and he went through that suffrage, he would have been the wazir or the savior for Egypt. So we can look at suffrage like the great poet Rabindranath Tagore says, that if the bird that flew off of a limb, the limb shakes, is it saying goodbye or it's saying hello?
Right.
We can look at, and in terms of spirituality, I remember before the mission of the prophet, God tells him in the earliest stage, stand up at night when everyone closed their doors in the quietude of night, and you build your spirituality first before you go on the mission.
Yeah.
You communicate with him when all doors are closed. When even your friend says, listen, don't call me after 12. I'm done. My phone is done.
Right.
God is saying, you know what? His is open. Stand up at night and worship. And I've been, this is something that I find very fortifying in this time of need. And when you do that yourself, you become a better server for those who are down and out in terms of bringing them up. So
thank you. Again, it's being in communication with that divine source, as you said. Anything you'd like to add, Rabbi?
I just want to say that the people on this panel are so smart. You guys are amazing. It's such a pleasure and honor to be with you. Thank you.
Sometimes as a chaplain, people are having a crisis of faith and they can't access prayer. And sometimes in that situation, I validate where they are. And, if they are very much a part of a spiritual tradition, I would say, well, this is the time to let others pray for you, to lean on the prayers of others. And also just similarly, the act of coming back to your breath as a way of connecting to a source greater than ourselves, that the divine love that is holding on to us and will never let us go. And thinking about the breath of God coming into us. So that's just a practice that I would offer. There's been those are the only questions we have, and just wanted to wrap up. There were a few comments that said that there's been a lot of thank yous out there, rightly so, to the healthcare heroes and essential care heroes and frontline heroes. But from this healthcare worker who's here, who's on one of the participants, a huge shout out to all of you, our spiritual and religious heroes. Thank you for your time and insight. And I want to thank you for the amazing insights and the time you have taken and the thought you have put into being here tonight. Thank you so very much. Again, you have provided a beautiful gift to the community, and that there are more things that unite us than divide us, right? If only we could truly internalize that, the world would be a much better place. So thank you very much, all of you, all the panelists. I am so grateful for your presence here tonight, and again, all of your thoughtful reflections. And thank you to all of you who have tuned into this session, and thank you for your participation, for joining us. And we ask that you kindly fill out the survey that will appear when this Zoom ends. So your feedback is very important to us. We hope that we will have more in this spirituality series in the future. So look for those in the future. So thank you, and everyone have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you, everybody. That was
Thank you.
great.
Thank you so much.